Welcome to everyone who's joining us. I'm Scott Lothes, President and Executive Director of the Center for Railroad Photography and Art, joined tonight by Paul Hammond and some others at the Colorado Railroad Museum, our partner for the current exhibition of paintings and photographs by Ted Rose, one of the great railroad artists in the United States, and an exhibition that, well, we'd planned to have this event out in Colorado back in March, but of course the world changed, and now it's October and we're coming to you online. We've been doing these programs via WebEx for about 6 months now. Just a few quick housekeeping notes as we go through this. There are several ways you can adjust the view of your screen. You access those by going to the circular buttons in the upper right-hand corner of your main window. You can switch between having the Hollywood Squares kind of version with a small window for each presenter, or you can switch back to having only the featured presenter large and the other window is small, and you might want to do that tonight since it'll only be one of us typically speaking at a time. Within that, you can make some changes if you want to maximize the screen. That's called the floating panel view. That will fill your whole screen with the presentation. And once you're within that, if you want to toggle back and forth between when we're sharing a screen and the speaker, there's a button with arrows pointing in opposite directions. You can click that to toggle back and forth between the two. For attendees, you aren't able to share audio or video, but you can communicate with us through the chat function and through the Q&A function. If you need to get to either of those, there should be buttons at the lower right-hand corner. If you don't see all of them, there should be a button with 3 little dots you can click to get additional options there. Both the chat and the Q&A should show up on the right-hand side of your menu. When we get to the Q&A section, we do ask that you try to put your questions into the Q&A, and Haley can then feed those to Paul and myself so that we can answer them. If you have comments you wish to share, put those in the chat function. That way, that just helps us, if possible, to segregate the comments from the questions that actually need responses. We had a really lively Q&A session for our last presentation, but everything was coming into the chat, both the comments and the questions, and we missed a couple of questions because of that. So if you can get all the questions into the Q&A and send your comments into the chat, we'll try to keep everything straight that way and get all the questions answered. Haley and Inga, 2 of our staff members, are on right now. If you have any questions, you can send a chat directly to them. They can answer those if you need any help or assistance with anything like that. And like all these presentations, we're recording tonight's show that will be made available on our YouTube page later on. That is youtube.com/railphotoart, and you can get all of our previous presentations there, as well as including our conference presentations from our spring and fall conference. Spring's already up, has been for a while. The fall presentations will be posted soon, as well as all of our there, and this one will be up probably next week sometime. It looks like we're having a little video buffering, and okay, I'm back now, and Paul's back. So good. Well, without further ado, I will turn over the virtual microphone, at least, to Paul Hammond, the director of the Colorado Railroad Museum. Paul and I have known each other for, I think, about a dozen years now, dating back to his time in Sacramento. And we've really enjoyed partnering with Paul at the various institutions he's been at. He's a great advocate and leader within the railroad heritage community, and someone we always enjoy working with, and we're delighted to be doing so with the Ted Rose exhibition. So Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Scott. And yeah, we're really delighted to be able to finally do this program and to once again be working with the center. So on behalf of the Colorado Railroad Museum, it is my pleasure to also welcome everyone out there in virtual land to tonight's special program about Ted Rose. I'm the executive director here at the Colorado Railroad Museum, and I'm here on site this evening in the museum's Richardson Research Library, along with our longtime volunteer and former executive director, Chuck Albi. Swing camera, wave, Chuck. Who many of you probably know from his many years of service here at the museum. He's going to be joining in this conversation on our end here in just a little while as well. So for those of you who don't know me, it might be helpful if I give a little bit of background, because how did I intersect with Ted Rose? How did I intersect with the Colorado Railroad Museum? Although I've only been working here a little bit over a year now, I have been working with this institution since the 1980s. And in the 1990s was when I intersected first with John Gruber and then also about the same time with Ted Rose. I'm a Southern California native, so that didn't come naturally without some movement. But I am a lifelong transportation enthusiast and historian. I caught the Railway Museum bug as a teenager and was very involved as a organizer, leader, and trustee, all of those volunteer positions at the Orange Empire Railway Museum, today the Southern California Railway Museum in Paris, near Riverside. While I was attending Cal Poly Pomona to get a degree and volunteering at the museum, I also worked for railroad publisher Interurban Press, first becoming one of their book editors, and then later overseeing the firm's book production and marketing efforts. The firm was bought out by Pentrex, and then from 1994 to 1997, under the Pentrex publishing banner, I became the second and final editor of Locomotive and Railway Preservation magazine. It was during my 2 years that I spent in Wisconsin. I was editor for 3, but 2 of them I was exiled to Wisconsin, that I first met John Gruber, who was editing the startup publication Vintage Rails, which was also a Pentrex publication. And interesting, this was also where I had my first direct contact with Ted Rose at the same time. When Pentrex started jettisoning their publications in 1997, I moved on to Sacramento, California, and the nonprofit California State Railroad Museum Foundation, where I became the marketing and development director. Got to oversee a lot of promotions and public relations for Railfair 99, which was another place where we intersected Ted Rose. We gathered together 56 guest locomotives and railroad cars from all over the world for 10 days in June 1999. I'm sure many of you remember that event. I went on to become several positions at the museum, ending up as the museum director. And during that time, John Gruber and I formed a strong relationship between the center and the museum. And it actually continues as well. From 2016 to 2018, I gained wings to serve as an executive director for a military aviation museum in Southern California, the Marchfield Air Museum, which was a lot of fun. But then I had this incredible opportunity to join the team here in Golden, Colorado. And here I am starting my second very interesting year with the museum. It has not gone quite like we'd expected. But I'm pleased to say that we're doing well in these uncertain times. And again, we're very pleased to be part of tonight's program. So I'm going to turn on a PowerPoint and go into a few of the connections that between this museum, Chuck Albi in particular, and then myself with my background that's kind of wandered around, how we intersected Ted Rose, and just kind of kick off through this program with that. Let's see, I have to share my screen. Great, and you'll get to see me. Now I'm trying to get it to do that. Okay. Is that working?
Looks good on my end, Paul.
Great. So some of those connections with Ted Rose. We had some connections back in 1994 with a Ted Rose cover painting that was commissioned for one of the Colorado Rail annuals. Of course, this was more my career, but Chuck had plenty of collisions with locomotive and railway preservation before and after my time. I thought, well, not after, but before. Ted Rose had several cover paintings, and I dragged him aboard to do a series. He was featured in several art shows. I wish I could actually fully document them. Online, I can find mentions of 1995 to 97. I know he was at Railfair 99 and participated in that art show. He may have done other things. So we look forward to finding out what we don't know. And then we're going to talk a little bit about a very long series of phone calls with some fun parts between Chuck Albi and Ted in the late 90s. So this is that rail annual cover. We'll show you the actual painting later on, but this was something kind of an interesting undertaking. Ted was not particularly known for taking on commissions where there was somebody had a very particular scene in mind. He usually kind of do it his own way. But he got talked into this by a very persuasive gentleman, Agostino Nastro Giuseppe, who at the time was involved with the museum as well as the Denver Public Library. And he wanted to make sure that Bob was properly honored in that rail annual, which was all about the newsletters that Bob, of course, had published for years and years and years. Locomotive and Railway Preservation, of course, I didn't start the magazine. Mark Smith was its founder and first editor, and he really kicked off the relationship with Ted Rose and had Ted Rose paintings on several of the covers. This was actually one of the ones that I helped edit, so I actually got the pleasure of letting Ted on one of my covers. But the big thing that I really had a great chance to work with Ted on, I was trying to figure out how to broaden the appeal of the magazine. And one of the things was how to bring art, not just, pictures and paintings, but their appreciation. Because in the preservation world, I think personally it's very important to bring in representations of the railroad in art, in all of its forms, including popular culture. And Ted basically offered to help. And we had to have some chats back and forth about how we were going to shape it and make sure that it fit. But his art and impressions column started in 1995, and in just 8 issues between when we started and when the magazine concluded its run, he featured a wide array of artists and works, including Gil Reed, Thomas Hart Benton, Franz Klein, Howard Fogg, and, as seen on your screen, Edward Hopper. The commentary, because he didn't just give us a picture, he always gave us something interesting like this one, Straight No Chaser. The point in this particular one was that Edward painted it like he saw it. There were no hidden messages. But commentary was sometimes laudatory. For instance, he called Gil Reed the standard bearer of the realist tradition in American art. Other times, critical. He did not mince words in his call on Thomas Hart Benton in the work Wreck of the Old 97, where Ted said, rather pointedly, his populist vision has distorted reality. So Ted had a nice way of telling you what he thought, but he also was very low key, and I would have to say it's unusual for an artist to be a good critic sometimes. He's very good. So as I said, I wish I knew all the times that Ted was involved in art shows in Sacramento, but I know I spent some time with and around him during the Fair at 99. That was quite a show. I was exhausted much of the time because I was overseeing the publicity and all of the media stuff, so that was another thing. But it was a great art show that happened at the museum during the event. And then, as we were just saying, we have this interesting period of connections with the Colorado Railroad Museum and Chuck Albi. I'm going to turn off, if I can figure this out. Let's see. Okay, Scott, you have to help me, or Haley.
So if you just roll your mouse up to the top of your screen, you should see the orange buttons up there.
There.
And if you, yeah, there we go.
Okay, great. Chuck is now going to take the stage.
Hi there, Scott. It's nice to visit with you again.
Nice to visit with you too, Chuck. You look good and sound good.
Oh, well, thank you. Let me give you a little bit of my background. I first met Bob Richardson back in 1953 when I was barely a teenager. My folks took me to visit the old narrow gauge museum in Alamosa. As the years went by, he opened here in Golden in 1959. I was one of the first visitors, July of that year, and later on became an active volunteer. Went on was member of the board of trustees for a while, and then when Bob retired in 1991, I succeeded him as executive director. So I've had a long association with the museum and with Bob. As a matter of fact, last year they gave me an award recognizing my 60 years of service to the Colorado Railroad Museum. It is a very nice plaque, but it's kind of like seeing your own tombstone. So that's my association with the museum. Before we get into Ted Rose right at the moment, I want to mention that I also had a good association with John Gruber. I was a subscriber to his publication from the very beginning, and John spent many hours out here on his trips to Colorado doing research in the library. And it was always a pleasure to have him here. He was a true gentleman.
All right, so I'm your off-camera interviewer now, Chuck. And I wanted you to just start off by pointing out one little thing about how you met up with Polly, Ted's widow, after Ted had died, and why these phone calls are kind of significant. Tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll go back in time.
Well, I first encountered Ted in about 1993, again on the phone, as Paul just said, in connection with his artwork that he was doing for the annual that we published that year. He also was gracious enough to let us use 2 or 3 of his other paintings involving the narrow gauge. But after Ted had passed away, my wife and I visited Santa Fe, and before our trip down there, I called Polly and said, we'd love to come in and meet you. She said, well, sure. Much to our surprise, she had us as her guests in their house there in Santa Fe, which is a marvelous place to get a feel of what Ted was like. And so when we first met, got together for dinner, she commented that she knew about my phone conversations with Ted, and how he'd always said that I was one of his good friends, somebody he enjoyed, and she thought we were very lifelong friends. But of course we weren't. And I said, well, I never met Ted in person. We just talked on the phone. And she was amazed. And that's what part of Ted's personality was, I think. He that here he could talk to somebody and never meet them and speak about them and gotten this great association.
So,
Hey, Paul, could I interrupt just for a second? And Chuck, could you just scooch a little bit closer to the microphone? I think we'll pick you up a little bit better that
There you
way.
go. This is my first round of doing one of these, so you got to bear with me.
No, that's fine. And that does sound a little bit better. Thanks so much. Sorry to interrupt.
tell us a little bit about your impressions of Ted Rose. What was he like as a person?
The thought that comes to mind as the old-fashioned expression was very down to earth. He didn't put on any pretensions. The only other noted railroad artist that I've had a contact with back years ago was meeting with Otto Coover. And Otto was very the old-fashioned gentlemanly person, but when you were with him, he very much gave the impression to you that you were in the presence of a great man.
Yeah. So what kind of things did you and Ted talk about? What did you want to call you for?
Well, now bear in mind this is going back a quarter of a century now, so my memory may not be up to date with the details. But we started out, as I said, in connection with the publication of the annual. And then he liked to ask questions about how the museum was doing. This was in the middle of the 90s. We were in the middle of our big fundraising project. It was the first major project of that nature we had, building the library where we're sitting today, buying additional land so we could feed our local track, constructing the roundhouse. In essence, those were the years that we built the foundation of what the museum has become today under Paul. So other than that, he would wanting to know all the progress, and occasionally he would ask for some help, like he'd be working on a painting and he'd want to know the timetable of the train back in the 1930s. When had they been in a certain place? So what the consist has been. So you get kind of a feel of what he wanted to represent. But aside from that, there was this general visiting. You know how it is when you're in any position, you would be aware of that, and certainly Paul is. There's certain people that when you pick up the phone and find out who they are, the reaction is, oh my, what's wrong now? But Ted was never like that. When I heard his voice on the other end of the line, and he just thought of us, hi, this is Ted. It was always a high point in the day. It was something that I looked forward to, and he sort of brought a little break, a little pleasure into the day at the office.
So you said that Ted was also interested in the Colorado Railroad Museum itself. Why? What kind of things did you want to ask questions about in that way?
Well, in addition to how our project was getting along, what we were doing with our equipment, one of his favorite engines at that time was the 491. And we had that on static exhibit. Then, and many years after, the last 2 years, we're very pleased to brought that back into operating condition. Those Rio Grande narrow gauge locomotives were a popular subject of his paintings, as you may know. And then he just get into asking how we were doing with our finances and just kind of taking a personal interest in the goings on. I think he had been known Bob Richardson in some respect for many years before, and he admired Bob. And here I was. Bob had retired after 48 years as executive director, founder, and here was this new guy on the block. What's happening? What's going on? And I think maybe he wanted a little reassurance about the direction that we were going, because the narrow gauge, as you know, is a very important thing in Ted's artistic and his personal life.
Do you have a favorite memory of one of those conversations with Ted?
I can't think of any in particular. I think my favorite memory, the way I think of him, as the incident of which I just mentioned, that every time he phoned, it was a pleasure to hear him. He was that kind of a guy.
All right. We're going to shift back now.
You're in charge now, Paul.
Kind of like raising the microphone now. There. All right. Now, try. Oops. Hang on. All right. Now I'm trying to shift back to shared screen. There it is. Okay. So that was Chuck. Thank you for that. Just a little wrap then. So we currently are showing the exhibit Railroads in the American Industrial Landscape. Ted Rose paintings and photographs here at the museum. You know, this is kind of your standard one of the walls of it. But when we mounted the exhibit, we decided to add a separate area kind of off to the side where we could showcase some additional things that we thought our guests might like to see. So I'm just going to roll quickly through those. Ted actually donated 2 different paintings to the museum. The first one, I was fascinated to discover that all three of the ones we have in our collection are untitled. But this one was actually commissioned for Frontier Airlines In-Flight magazine. And it probably wasn't his first choice of subjects, and he probably thought the museum ought to have it. And we're very, very pleased to, because it's a little different from most of his work. A little known thing about Ted is he designed the Santa Fe Southern's first paint scheme. So when he painted this untitled painting, it wasn't done on commission or anything as far as we know. Same thing, he later on offered it to the museum, and we're pleased to have it in our collection now because this is a big part of Rocky Mountain heritage. And of course, having the original of that painting that was commissioned for one of our rail annuals was a real delight, and this is a beautiful painting in its entirety. Ted, of course, one of his more widely seen things was this postal stamp series. I'm sure many of you out there are aware of this. We thought it was worth showcasing because this is just Ted branching out into a much broader audience. And I will say these came out just in time. Actually, that should say 1998. The copyright date on the stamps, I looked it up, is 1998. They came out just in time for us to turn around and sell them at rail fair, so it's kind of fun. And then many of you are probably also aware, this may be one of his all-time most widely distributed art products. It's a fantastic book, and the illustrations really do the story justice. So that's it from us in Golden right now. To everyone out there joining the conversation, we are so pleased to be sharing this with you. Let's see what I can do. Stop sharing. And I'm going to turn things at this point back over to Ted. We only wish that we had time to have everyone share their memories of Ted because we really wasn't eager to do that.
Well, thanks, Paul and Chuck. Wonderful, wonderful memories and experiences with Ted that you both shared. And as I said earlier, Paul and I met about a dozen years ago, and it's just always a pleasure to work with you. And we're so glad to be able to partner with you down at the Colorado Railroad Museum. So I'm gonna finish us out here tonight. And it's been interesting to have sort of these personal and intimate memories of Ted. And I'm actually going to zoom out a little bit and talk a bit more about Ted's life and his work, and then kind of zoom back in and take a closer look at his painting as well as his photography. And so, again, Chuck and Paul, thank you both. Chuck's a member of both of our organizations, and I know I speak for all of us when I say how fortunate we are to have Chuck's involvement. The Center for Railroad Photography and Art relies on the support of our community and partnerships with other institutions to showcase our work, and it is just our honor and privilege to be working with each of you, so thank you. We also have a tremendous board and staff, and I want to particularly acknowledge tonight Haley Page, our exhibitions and events coordinator, who's the person working behind the scenes on our traveling exhibitions and online events. As I mentioned at the start, we've been hosting at least one of these online programs every month since April. You can find recordings of all of our past presentations on our YouTube channel, including this one. It'll be posted next week, youtube.com/railphotoart. So let's see, back when we were originally planning for this presentation to happen at the museum in March, I think I was the fourth choice for tonight's keynote lecture. I never met Ted Rose, nor even spoke with him on the phone, as Chuck did. I've long admired his watercolors, but I'm hardly an expert on them. And while today I am the president and executive director of the Center for Railroad Photography and Art, the organization that put together this traveling exhibition, I was nothing more than another dues-paying member when our founder, John Gruber, assembled this show back in 2006. The photographic prints in the exhibition come from that original show, and they were made by Ted himself in the 1970s. The original show also featured a number of paintings on loan from the Ted Rose studio. Now, since then, we've had the great good fortune to receive 4 of Ted's paintings as donations, along with a wonderful charcoal drawing that came directly from Polly, his widow. Those 5 works of art, plus the things the Colorado Railroad Museum added, comprise the current exhibition, along with the photographs that Ted made. So I'm now going to share my screen. And let's see here. I'm going to set my background for just a moment. And now I think, okay. Does that look good on your guys' end there?
Looks great.
Okay, thanks, Haley. So what I can offer you is an in-depth study of Ted's photography. And that was something we didn't have in 2006 when we first put together this exhibition. The Rose Collection was the first big photography collection we took on at the center, and it came to us as a gift from Ted's widow, Polly. Before he died, Ted had told her that if anyone could do anything with his photography, John Gruber could. And we're pleased that Ted had that much confidence in our founder, and we're certainly trying to carry that legacy forward. Now, back then, we were a smaller organization. We didn't have our own archivist on staff, and taking on the Rose Collection was only possible because of Art Miller, who then served on our board of directors and who was the archivist at Lake Forest College. With Art's guidance, a volunteer there, David Mattoon, and a student worker, Harris Miller, completed the initial processing of the Rose Collection, getting it into secure and archival safe housing, as well as recording metadata and doing some low-resolution scanning so that we could see what we had. We've done more work on the collection since then, including high-resolution scanning by graduate student intern Colleen O'Keefe, working under Art's successor, Ann Thomason, now the archivist at Lake Forest College. Thanks to their collective efforts, I have been able to view an enlarged, positive image of each and every one of Ted's more than 4,000 railroad photographs, and I doubt that even Ted himself ever did that. From that, I can tell you this. Even if Ted Rose had never lifted a paintbrush, we should still be here tonight to celebrate his photography. Now, Ted was an artist in the purest sense, creating works of art with every medium he tried. He pursued photography seriously for only a few years. And had he continued, I'm confident that we would hold up his photographs today alongside those of Richard Steinheimer and Jim Shaughnessy. Ultimately, though, I think we're fortunate that Ted traded in his cellulose for pigment. The railroad photography world has had its Steinheimers and Shaughnessy's, and so many others. The railroad art world, while blessed with many talented painters, has never had anyone else quite like Ted Rose. There are other artists who paint railroads with greater detail and more precision than Ted did, but I don't think there's been anyone to paint the emotions of railroading better than Ted Rose. Tonight I want to tell you a little bit more about Ted and his work, both his photographs, along with this exhibition, and some of what we've learned since we first put it together a decade and a half ago. Ted was born in 1940 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and that's where he grew up, the oldest of 3 children. Ted's childhood and adolescent experiences in Milwaukee profoundly shaped who he became as an artist and as a person. This is Ted's painting of Milwaukee's fabled beer line, an industrial branch of the Milwaukee Road that served 3 of the city's big breweries. Another of the center's photography collections, Wallace Abbey's, contains many excellent photographs of the beer line, and I think that Ted may have even used an Abbey photograph as source material for this painting. Earlier this month, we featured the beer line in another online presentation, which you can view on our YouTube channel if you're interested. Milwaukee is a diverse, blue-collar, and deeply industrial city, forged by brewing, manufacturing, shipping, and railroads. For most of Ted's childhood and adolescence, his family lived on the south side of the Menominee River Valley, home to the sprawling shops and yards of the Milwaukee Road. He portrayed them in this 2002 painting, which he titled Shop Pit. Now, Ted's father was an architect who encouraged his oldest son's interest in art and would frequently take Ted and his younger brother out to see the sights of their home city, architectural and also industrial. Ted portrayed one such outing in his 1989 painting titled Thanks, Pop, set at the Milwaukee Road train station. That's Ted with his father and brother at lower left in the painting. Even in Ted's early work, I can see traces of the appreciation for design and form, for history and industry that his father and the city of Milwaukee helped impart. Yet the first railroad I associate with Ted Rose is not the Milwaukee Road, but the Illinois Central. At least that's the impression I got looking through Ted's work. In his photography, I found nothing from the Milwaukee Road, nor even the city of Milwaukee, but I found plenty of Illinois Central material. And it turns out the IC held deep personal meaning for Ted. His mother's family came from Illinois, and he was back there at age 14 for his grandmother's funeral. After the service, Ted wandered out to the tracks, where an Illinois Central steam locomotive passed before him. He would later recall that engine as an omen, a symbol that crystallized his love of railroads. Within a year, and with his parents' blessing, he began traveling independently, by train and later by car, throughout North America to see its railroads. He began photographing in earnest around this same time, continuing through his college years at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, a location that further solidified the significance of Illinois Central in Ted's life. I think two other factors contributed to Ted's love of the IC. Regular steam operations continued into 1959, downstate in the coal fields around Carbondale, which Ted experienced and photographed. And there are some of his best photographs of steam railroading in the United States. This is a view inside the roundhouse at Carbondale. But beyond that, Ted loved the blues music and culture that radiated out of the South. Growing up in Milwaukee, he tuned in nightly to WLAC, broadcasting rhythm and blues out of Nashville, Tennessee, with 50,000 watts of power radio. Ted wrote, "This was amazing stuff that spoke of another world, a larger world than my own. I never looked back." For Ted, the Illinois Central, main line of mid-America, provided a direct railroad connection to that larger world. Delta blues sounds like the Illinois Central Railroad, Ted wrote, especially the music of country bluesman Fred McDowell. Ted admired McDowell so much that he made this painting of him, playing his guitar in the cool blue shade with the red caboose of an icy freight train rolling by in the hot sunlight. At least two other experiences during Ted's college years shaped his life every bit as much, and probably more, than what he learned in the university classrooms at Urbana-Champaign. First, he began working during the summers for Kalmbach Publishing Company in downtown Milwaukee, publisher of trains and model railroader magazines, along with railroad books. That's Ted standing in the doorway, holding something in his hands, with much of the Kalmbach staff. Legendary editor David P. Morgan stands at lower left. Founder Alcy Kalmbach stands at lower right, below Ted. Ted worked in the art department, and his youth, his temporary status, and a carefree attitude that sometimes clashed with corporate culture, he elicited Kalmbach's ire by coming into the office barefoot one day. Ted got to do some pretty meaningful work. His superiors clearly recognized and exploited his talents, and Ted's assignments included the layout and design for Richard Steinheimer's book, Backwoods Railroads of the West, which many of us now consider a landmark of railroad publishing. Working at Kalmbach, Ted gained exposure and contacts that would help him throughout his life, not to mention earning some money to fund his ever-expanding travels. Now, Ted certainly didn't spend the entirety of every college summer working for Kalmbach. As steam operations ended on railroads in the United States, he traveled first to Canada, where he found scenes like this one on the Canadian National, as well as the Canadian Pacific. And he then went south to Mexico, seeking more of the steam railroading that so stirred his soul. There were two big trips to Mexico, one in the late summer of 1960, and another, even longer journey the following year. He made these and other excursions with his friend Robert Ludwig, who's worked with our archivist, Adrian Evans, to help us identify the locations of many of Ted's photographs from Mexico. Robert also provided us with this wonderful color photograph of Ted riding on the roof of a train in Mexico. And he also sent a scan of a delightful letter from Ted about the planning for that trip in 1961. Robert had suggested spending less time in Mexico in favor of more time in the US. Ted would have none of it. "Howdy," Ted began. "Regarding Mexico and such places, you were out of your mind. Fool around here another week while compounds abound and time runs out for a particular three-cylinder Pacific? Remain among GP9s when GR43s are to be found? Stay here while number 110 is narrow gauge and steam? Pass up UDY Ancients and slight Apizaco on an inadequate trip? Great hat, my good man, such a trip would be somewhat of a travesty. Let us add another week. Note the obvious improvements." And there followed Ted's proposed itinerary for 5 weeks of chasing steam in Mexico. In the end, I believe Ted stayed for 6 weeks. And it was on these 2 trips to Mexico that he made his finest photographs. He shot the main lines, the narrow gauge branch lines, the locomotives, the train crews, and the roundhouses, the back shops, and their workers. He got up close for intimate details, back for sweeping landscapes. He shot on misty mornings, in slanting sunlight, and in the mystery of the night. And then it ended. Ted graduated from the University of Illinois in 1962 with honors and, I quote, "without a clue about what I wanted to do." This began a restless period for Ted, which included a single semester of graduate school in New Orleans, 2 years with the Army in Vietnam, at least 2 more stints at Kalmbach, 3 months of working as a switchman for the Chicago and Northwestern, and several months of, quote, "doing nothing" in Chama, New Mexico, where the Rio Grande's narrow gauge operations and friendly railroaders provided sustenance. Now, Ted eventually made his way from Chama to Santa Fe, and you could say that was the beginning of the rest of his life. The art museum there hosted modeling sessions, not with model trains, but with real live models that Ted and other artists would draw. One of those models was a woman named Polly Towers. Ted met her in early 1967. They fell in love and were married in July. For the next 15 years, Ted focused on his career and his family. He worked a variety of jobs doing illustration and graphic design work for the city and the state. He and Polly purchased a lot in town where they salvaged a couple of old buildings and constructed a beautiful adobe house and studio, doing most of the work themselves. This is my photograph of Polly inside their kitchen in 2015. Their family grew with a son and a daughter, and as Ted's reputation grew throughout the city, he began taking on more freelance work, going entirely independent in 1976. Now, at that point, Ted hadn't painted or photographed much of anything since about 1963. He visited his photography once in the mid-1970s when a friend and neighbor loaned him her darkroom equipment. He made the prints that are in this exhibition, and he displayed them in a few galleries in Santa Fe, but that was about it. We are so fortunate to have Ted's own original prints in this exhibition. He photographed fearlessly in all kinds of weather and light, and I can tell you from my experience in the digital darkroom that his images are not easy to print. Yet for someone who did relatively little black and white printing in his life, Ted brought out the full spectrum of emotions from his negatives. But he never photographed seriously again after those halcyon days of his late teens and early 20s. When it came to painting, at least for himself, he took a nearly complete hiatus for about 20 years. There were scars from Vietnam and also a tremendous sense of loss for the world where he had grown up. He wrote about this, saying, "Railroad places and the industrial landscape were in serious decline by 1960. Their overall image was one of decay, and I knew then that I had no interest in depicting the quaintness of old things representing such despair. Melancholy is not for the young. Yet as Ted's family and career blossomed, he realized he was carrying inside him stories he needed to tell. Stories of steam and light, of locomotives and railroad workers, of the industrial fabric of the American landscape. Stories best told with brushes, paper, and water-soluble pigments. Deeply personal stories. It's what each of Ted's paintings is. Like Mississippi Fred McDowell with his blues guitar, Ted used his brushes to tell the stories of his America. He started painting again in 1983, with Polly's full support and her direct encouragement to dig deep into his railroad past, regardless of whether the resulting works would sell or not. Ted was concerned they would not. They did, of course, so much so that by 1989, he was painting full-time. My reality often involves railroad subjects, Ted wrote. Railroad places are a significant part of the landscape and the reason much of the country looks the way it does. The American place is often a railroad place, man-made and human scale, urban, industrial, or rural. So I'm a realist. I have to work my paintings. I work to have my paintings take on a life of their own. I think of them as small fictions, part of a narrative set in place and time, with my own sense of reality to bring them off. If I'm able to set the contextual stage well enough, viewers can see the play or experience my reality as akin to their own. Ted painted furiously for 2 decades. He shared himself in his paintings, and I think in the process he may have made peace with his youthful restlessness and with much of what he lost from that time. Writing about his return to painting, he said, "There was a certain desperation in my early travels, as though by noticing and seeing for the first time, I could recoup a past that I hadn't paid attention to, that had been adolescent and pretty normal, as if things would always be the same. My own changes were synonymous with changes all around me, none of which I could prevent." His photography provided him with a deep well of imagery and inspiration, giving visual form to the experiences and memories that inspired so much of his painting. "Without memory and direct involvement," he wrote, "subject matter never obtains the status of symbol or cohesive statement for me." Sometimes Ted worked directly from his photographs to produce a painting, like this one from the Grand Trunk Western in Detroit during a trip in the late 1950s, which he rendered in watercolors 4 decades later, calling it Detroit Kind of Day. And this photograph, taken during the same trip, and it became the basis for another painting, Road Crew, which Ted made in 1993, adding another locomotive in the distance, the atmosphere of falling snow and swirling steam, and the humanity of 2 train crew members trudging through the raw weather to climb aboard their steed. Often the connection between Ted's photographs and his paintings is subtler. He loved the backwoods, short-line railroads of the South, where steam lasted longer than it did on the main lines, where the railroaders tended to be friendlier, and the trains, quite literally, sang the blues music that Ted loved so much. We've been looking at Ted's photographs of the Twin Seams Mining Company in Kellerman, Alabama, from about 1960. This is his painting of the same operation done in 1998. And I can't help but thinking that this photograph, also from Twin Seams Mining, might have inspired this painting from the nearby Mississippian Railway, also done in 1998. Ted stopped painting in 2002, when cancer claimed him at age 61. This and the next few watercolors are just a few of the many he painted in 2002, the year he died. Ted may not have photographed the Milwaukee of his youth, but in his final months he returned to it for many paintings, saving, until the end, some of his most personal stories, like the now long-gone Milwaukee Road Station, and the electric trains of the Chicago North Shore in Milwaukee, which had whisked teenage Ted to downtown Chicago in just 80 minutes, and which stopped running in 1963. Ted painted far more than his hometown of Milwaukee in 2002, and I can't help but think about them without getting tears in my eyes. These watercolors from the final months of Ted's life are not the last gasps of a dying man. They're the work of a musician, a virtuoso, a bluesman on the stage for one last song, playing his heart out until the very last note. Now, I thought about ending with that last slide, but there's still one part of Ted's story that doesn't fully resolve for me, and that's his photography from Mexico. I should add here that it would be perfectly fine with Ted for part of his story not to resolve. He said, "All of my paintings are works in progress, part of an unfinished resolution. Some paintings never resolve. All are workable." So here's the part that I'm trying to make work. I spent much of my adult life making my own railroad photographs and studying other people's railroad photographs. When it comes to telling the story of a railroad in a particular time and place, Ted's photographs from Mexico are as good a body of photography as any I have ever seen. Period. Full stop. They portray the beauty of the land, the dignity of its people, and the drama of its railroads. Along the lines, behind the scenes, up close, and from far away. So I'm left wondering, where are Ted's watercolors of Mexican railroads? Once he started painting again, in addition to producing many works featuring contemporary scenes, Ted returned to seemingly every other touchstone of his youth and adolescence, except for Mexico. I'm sure he must have painted at least a few Mexican scenes, but there are none in his own book of his life's work, In the Traces, published by Indiana University Press in 2000, with an introduction by Thomas H. Garver, for which I am grateful for much of the information about Ted I've shared with you tonight. Nor are there any paintings of Mexico in the exhibition catalog that the center published 6 years later. And now perhaps there's a trove in storage somewhere, and what an exhibition that would be. Or perhaps, even as Ted came to embrace making a living by painting railroads, he saw little to no market for material from south of the border. I could certainly understand the prudence of such a decision, yet an artistic decision based on economic prudence just doesn't resolve with what I've come to know about Ted Rose. So maybe there's another explanation. It's a notion that I rather like, but to inject quite a lot of personal bias into this thought. So maybe, just maybe, for those few weeks in the late summers of 1960, 1961, out there under the Mexican sun, surrounded by people for whom the steam railroad was part of the fabric of everyday life, Ted came to see himself as I do, as an artist with a camera, whose photographs can stand on their own and speak for themselves, not just as reference material for paintings, but as finished products of the creative process. I like that. I just wish he'd had the time to print more of them. Thank you. And thanks again to Paul, to Chuck, and to everyone at the Colorado Railroad Museum partnering with us on this exhibition and tonight's event. I'd be happy to take any questions.
I have one question that came in for Paul
Sure.
from earlier in your presentation. I'm sure we'll get some more in a few minutes. Mike Davis is curious if the Colorado Railroad Museum has any records of which narrow gauge magazines had articles published by Ted Rose?
What I would say to that is we have not documented as such, because even as I prepared for tonight's, our part of the presentation, I had to go look everything up or talk to Chuck and hope he remembered. So that's a great question, but that is an archive yet to be established on its own.
Great. I just wanted to go back and rewind and say, great presentation, Scott. I mean, just wow.
Thank you, and wonderful, wonderfully poignant memories from Paul and from Chuck that really helped bring Ted to life, and certainly added a lot to some of the more biographical stuff I shared. So a wonderful, wonderful partnership here tonight.
Well, we have to say we enjoyed your going into the what ifs and what might have beens and resolutions. Because it does help you really stop and think when you had someone like Ted. He died too soon.
He certainly did.
There are certain things we'll never know.
No. And I remember when I went and stayed with Polly in 2015, she still has a number of Ted's paintings, and I was amazed and deeply touched by the number that he had done in 2002. It was like he was in this race to just get out everything that was still inside of him while he still could. And I mean, even now I can't really talk about that without getting a little bit choked up. I mean, that's just that beauty of the artist at work. And as you say, he certainly left us too soon. But what a visual legacy he left behind.
And Scott, you may have mentioned this earlier, but do you have a approximate number of how many watercolors Ted made?
I am not sure, but he was certainly prolific. It must be in the several hundreds, if not 1,000. I think he was just pretty much always painting in those 20 years. He did a lot of small paintings. Another quote he had was that small ideas deserve small paintings, or something along those lines. And he did some large paintings too, but a lot of these are they're 9 by 12, they're 10 by 14, and I think he was able to do them pretty quickly, and certainly with no lack in quality or anything else. But he was. We had some ideas that he was just able to get onto the paper pretty quickly, and others that he worked out a bit longer. But he was certainly prolific, and we're delighted to have a few of those works in our collections, as well as his complete collection of photography, about 4,000 negatives that we have in our archives, all of which have been scanned and digitized. And again, they cover just that really short period from about 1958 until 1963 that he was really active photographing in the U.S., Canada, and Mexico.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier we have a few of his watercolors, and we know that the Colorado Road Museum has a few. Do you know where else, what other institutions may have some of his paintings in collection? There's a number that are in private collections. There's a number in museums. I know Kalmbach in Waukesha, Wisconsin, has several in their corporate collection. But Ted had a lot of clients and did a lot of work for a lot of people, and that's. It's hard to get all of this stuff together in one place to see it all, but on the other hand, it's part of the strength of the preservation is that it's dispersed to so many different places. Those paintings are treasured heirlooms, and in a lot of different places, and certainly we'd be very interested in taking on more if we had the opportunity to do so, to hopefully increase our Rose exhibition and holdings, and it's just great that there's so many out there in so many different places. I'm sure California State Railroad Museum has a number too. Do you know how many they would have, Paul?
I don't remember a number, but they had at least 2 and maybe 4 when I was there.
Sure.
Do you know if Ted did much color photography?
As a teenager in early 20s, I don't think he did any. He did a little bit of color slides as an adult. I know we have a few of the Santa Fe Railroad and the Santa Fe Southern, the short line in Santa Fe that Paul mentioned that he designed the paint scheme for. But these were more kind of armchair rail, well, not armchair, but a car window rail fan at this point. He was
they're certainly, competently executed, but he just didn't photograph very much. So the real strong body of his photography is just from those few years from the late 50s and early 60s, and that's entirely black and white, split about 50-50 between 35 millimeter and 2 1/4 medium format.
And we know he did a lot of work in Mexico, and I believe looking back through what we have in the exhibit, we have images throughout the Midwest. Did he ever get up to the Pacific Northwest or New England, or what exactly was his geographic reach of the U.S.?
So, I mean, he was most interested in steam locomotives, and so he went where steam was still running. And by the time he was photographing in the late 1950s, that was not very many places. So he went to Canada a good bit, the Canadian prairies in particular. Steam was still pretty prevalent on Canadian National and Canadian Pacific in 1958 and 1959. In the US, his photography is kind of all over the map. There's a lot from the Midwest. The Illinois Central, as I mentioned earlier, the Burlington was still running some steam in southern Illinois and nearby in Kentucky on the IC. He did some of the short lines in the South. There's in Appalachia. He got to the N&W once or twice in Virginia, where they were still running steam on their main line. In Colorado, he photographed the Colorado and Southern operation. I know he photographed the narrow gauge a little bit after he went out to Chama, although he wasn't really photographing it as much at that point in his life. So, again, it's really just kind of these pockets of where steam was still running, and then all over Mexico. And again, those, I'd say the Mexican photographs, I don't think they make up quite 50%, but they were certainly his most prolific trips, and, again, for my money, his most creative and evocative work.
I'm not sure if either of you would know this, but Bill Devine is wondering, does anyone know where Ted is buried?
I would guess in Santa Fe, although I almost wonder if he may have been cremated, but I'm not positive about that.
I sure don't know that one either, but I would actually go with your guess if we were on Jeopardy right now.
I'm sure Polly would know. We'll have to ask her.
Well, we're getting near the end of our presentation time. There's a few more questions lingering on.
I'm happy to stick around.
Yeah, no worries here.
Okay, Jacob Adams is curious, did Ted work for any railroads themselves during his lifetime?
I know he was a switchman for the Chicago and Northwestern for about 3 months in kind of that restless period after he graduated from college. I think that was the only one, although certainly, he did some corporate work for the Santa Fe Southern, in designing their paint scheme and probably some of the he would have executed for them. That's the only ones I'm aware of. Do you know of any others, Paul?
No. I cannot imagine him wanting to work for a railroad after he got his feet on the ground.
No, I couldn't either. Actually, from what I know of his personality, it does not seem like a good mix. If he didn't want to wear shoes to work at Combach, I can't imagine he'd want to lace up steel-toed boots to work on the railroad.
Yeah.
Let's see. Oh, no, he meant commissions for the railroad.
Yeah. So again, just those for the Santa Fe Southern are really the only ones I would be aware of. Yeah, I'm not sure about that. Well, Chuck and Paul, you mentioned Ted's kind of reluctance to do much work where the client had sort of any visions of what the finished piece would look like. I think Ted really wanted just about complete artistic control in his commitments.
Yeah, that seems to play out in what I know, and I think what Chuck knows of Ted. The painting that we have is kind of interesting because of that, the one that was painted for the annual.
As I think about it, that's why, as I think about it, that may be why an indication that that Ted admired Bob Richardson so much, he was willing to make this exception to his general rule.
That does speak really well to their relationship. That's a good point.
I think we've gotten through most of the questions now. I'm trying to keep on track of them as they're all filtering through. Had a few questions about the exhibit and if there are any plans for it to travel any more destinations after the Colorado Railroad Museum. And
that's probably a question for you, Haley.
It's been in circulation since 2006. It made its debut at the Haggerty Museum at the Marquette University in Milwaukee, and it's been traveling on and off now for over 10 years, 14 years. And we don't have any plans for continuing the venue at the moment. The exhibition schedules have been a bit delayed over the past year, but we'd love to keep it in circulation, and we are definitely still looking for venues who'd be interested in exhibiting it in the future.
Yes, and if you're anywhere near Colorado, it's going to be here basically through the end of the year and a couple of days into early January before it comes down.
Yeah, and you guys did a beautiful job on the installation, and I love that you used a kind of a rose-colored wall for the background. That's a nice nod, and it certainly looks good with his work too. So really great installation there.
That's a nod to Elizabeth Nussick, our exhibition designer here, as it were. So
well, yeah. She did a great job.
Photos look great. I think we talked about this a little earlier on, but there were a couple of people interested in photography books on Ted Rose's work, and if maybe you could list off a few of the names of the publications that you'd mentioned earlier. Photo books that feature Ted Rose's photography and painting.
Was that a question for Paul or for me?
For either. I know we may have touched on both of that. Both of you may have touched on some of the publications that have been made with his work.
Well, so I mean, oh, go ahead, Paul.
Well, I was going to say, I think my list is shorter. Certainly, the best gathered up works are that self-published work that he did in, I believe, 2000. What was the name of that, Scott?
That was In the Traces. It was self-authored. It was actually published by Indiana University Press.
Yes, okay.
He also did a calendar based on the Chile line to Santa Fe that came out several.
Right.
Three different calendars for Amtrak, I believe, right in the late 90s. So those are out in popular circulation. Locomotive and railway preservation, I did not spend the time trying to figure out which issues had what, but if you like simply reading his little commentaries on various artists, those actually got started in towards the end of 1996, I believe it is. So you can find those in a lot of archives.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And of course, the center published our Railroads in the American Industrial Landscape, Ted Rose Paintings and Photographs. That came out in 2006 in conjunction with the Haggerty Museum and the exhibition there. It is actually out of print now, and we may have to look into possibly doing a second printing of that at some point. I think it is available sometimes on the used market. We did also do a special issue of our journal, Railroad Heritage, specifically featuring Ted's photography. I believe that was issue number 19, and we do have back issues of that available for sale off of our website, which it's a pretty good overview of Ted's photography and features most of the prints that are in the exhibition at the Colorado Railroad Museum right now.
Are either of you aware of what type of cameras, what formats, or what he used for his photography?
I'm not sure the models themselves, but I know he used both a 35 millimeter system as well as a 2¼ square medium format. I don't know if he had a Yashica or a Rolleiflex or something like that, but I think it was one of the cameras with the waist level viewfinder that you'd look down into, and had a focusing lens as well as the taking lens. And he used that for his earliest photography, and I think for the last trip to Mexico, and so sometime between 1960 and 1961, he also had a 35 millimeter camera. He took both of those to Mexico for that second trip, and I think kind of gradually, and shot about equally in Mexico with the two, and I think gradually shifted to 35 millimeter for his last year or two of photography. He did some very nice work with both of them, I have to say. In the scans we have, I'm somewhat favor the larger medium format negatives and the better image quality they produce. The 35 millimeter negatives are perfectly fine, but the larger format negatives, and I think he just had a really sharp lens in whatever that medium format camera he was using. Those are really gorgeous negatives.
Mm-hmm. And the last question, maybe a hard question. How would you compare Ted's watercolors with some of Howard Fogg's work, and is it even worth comparing them? Are they comparable?
I guess I'll take a quick stab and hope that Paul and Chuck might have some opinions to jump in with as well. But while you two gather your thoughts, for me it's a difficult comparison. I mean, I think Howard and Ted really had a different style, different goals in their paintings. As I mentioned, I mean, Howard and some others, I think, really, strove for detailed accuracy, and certainly that was something that was on Ted's mind. But I think he was really concerned with that emotive aspect of his paintings and really kind of conveying the emotions of railroading and the feelings of being out trackside and the feelings of these industrial places. And so he may not have been as concerned with the details, but he was certainly deeply concerned with conveying the emotions and feelings of the railroad landscape. And so I think his work is almost singular in the railroad community for having that focus and for having someone who was able to execute on it as beautifully as Ted was.
Yeah, I'd echo that, Scott. Fogg certainly is one of the greats, but it was about getting everything right. And for Ted, it's more of a feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, the details are actually right, but you can't count the rivets.
Right.
You get a feel. And the other thing that Ted did that is unique to watercolor and the medium he was working with, if you know how to work it, is he was very much a master of light.
Yeah.
And of clouds, of smoke, of skies. He just got he's looking at one of his paintings. It was almost, you could feel its sense what was going on, like that one in the Banshee train, the headlight coming out of the Mamba tunnel. You could hear the dynamic brakes. It's just, I don't know how he did it, but he achieved it.
No, I think about one of his paintings on the Canadian prairies of a grain elevator and a steam locomotive in the distance sweeping into a curve, and it's winter, it's the brown fields and the gray sky. I mean, just one of those blah drab days that I'd probably pack up my cameras and go home. And yet, Ted just captured that winter mood in such a way that it's almost better than being there. And when you look at Ted's painting, it's so deeply felt, and he really was able to convey that in his just exquisite use of light and tonality and composition. It's I don't know, I'm always in awe of his work.
I go one step further and say, I don't think it was possible for him to take that photograph to make a bet.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, and this is nothing against Fogg because I very much like his work too, but I'm a rail enthusiast. You don't even have to like trains, I believe, to like Ted's work.
Yeah.
you know, it has that sort of universality of the just the railroad and the fabric of life, and you can appreciate that from Ted's paintings, whether you're a railroad enthusiast or not.
Yeah, if you search him online, you know, you'll get various mentions from galleries and a lot of different things. It's very different. Again, his work was not by commission the same way that many other railroad illustrators and artists have been.
I believe he was a member of the American Watercolors Society.
Yeah, he was. And yeah, he was thought very highly of by his watercolor peers, by his art peers. So.
Well, I mean, just to come to a place like Santa Fe, that is, you know, I mean, it's you know, really one of the great art communities in the country, and to be able to not only make it there, but to really, I think, thrive as Ted did. I mean, that alone, I think, speaks a great deal to the appeal of his work, you know, both within and beyond the railroad community.
Yep, and painting trains of all things.
Interesting that both Ted and Otto Cooler gravitated to Santa Fe.
Both
different artists, but
yes,
there they were.
Yeah, it was interesting, Chuck, to hear your comments about the differences in personalities between Ted and Otto Cooler. It seems like they could hardly have been more different.
Great. I think we've gone through most of the questions, and I apologize for anyone if we missed any along the way, but I think we got to most of them.
Well, thanks everyone for tuning in, and certainly if you think of other questions later for Paul or me, you know where to find us on our email and websites and social media. So get those to any of us, and we'll make sure they get to the right person, and we'll certainly try to get them answered if we can. But thanks again for joining. Paul and Chuck, thank you so much for hosting the show and for joining us tonight and sharing your memories of Ted. That really added a lot of personal meaning to tonight's event. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott.
Yep, thank you. This has been a great program, and I'm so glad that we got to finally do it this year before it was too late.
That's right. We snuck it in there. So thanks for the flexibility, and Haley, thanks for all your good work on the back end to make these work. And we'll get this up on our YouTube site next week and share it widely.
Yep.
All right. Well, good night, everyone. Thanks so much.
Good night.